This is the story of how John Brown helped Kentucky become the 15th state and then became its first senator. It's the love story of John and Margaretta Brown and how he built Liberty Hall and shared it with her. Descendants of John and Margaretta Brown have gathered for a family reunion at Liberty Hall.
You do look like him.
You think so?
You can't. Now bring your lips down.
John Brown's sister, Catherine, tries to determine if her brother looks like their illustrious ancestor, John Brown, one of Kentucky's founding fathers.
Okay, ready? No. Eyebrows. Okay, ready?
Yes.
There's another painting in the dining room. Want to take a look at it?
Fantastic.
It was painted when he first went to the Continental Congress.
There he is.
I don't know about that one. It's a bit of a stretch.
I would say so.
I like the shirt, though.
The ruffles are great.
I brought my son and daughter here to become acquainted with their relatives and their ancestors.
And John Brown had retired and was still a prominent guy. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson. In fact, they'd shared a room a boarding house when he was a senator.
I like to imagine John and Margaretta when they first moved into Liberty Hall, waking up in this room and seeing this same sunlight on these same floorboards, birds making the same kind of racket outside. They probably breakfasted in this room, on these very dishes. John worked in an office at home. For 36 years, John and Margaretta lived together at Liberty Hall. Through good times, they entertained 3 presidents here in one day. And hard times, 3 of their 5 children died here. While serving as senator in Philadelphia, John meets and falls in love with Margaretta Mason, a smart, well-educated New Yorker whose father was, like John's, a Presbyterian minister. John writes Margaretta from Philadelphia.
How is it possible for us now to doubt our mutual love? The warmest wish of my heart is to make you happy.
John is 41, Margaretta 26, when they marry and move together to Philadelphia. The 30 senators in the U.S. Congress meet in this room in Congress Hall. In November 1799, their baby Mason is born. A few months later, John travels to Kentucky to prepare Liberty Hall for their arrival.
Adieu, my love. Kiss my dear boy, and shake his chubby fist for me.
Our sweet boy has cut a tooth since I last wrote. My love, oh that you could have but one glance at him as he now lies asleep on the carpet. I enclose a little lock of his hair which was cut off, like Samson's, in his sleep. In 8 weeks more, you will return to the arms of your Margaretta.
When Kentucky became a state, Frankfort was still mostly woods. But John, having great faith in the future of Frankfort as the state capital, bought 4 acres along the river and decided to build a very grand house there. It took several years. He had the land cleared and used the wood from those trees to build Liberty Hall. The earth he had dug out for the basement was used to make the bricks at a local kiln. At the end of this trip to Frankfort, John writes,
I've never spent the same length of time as disagreeably as the last 4 months, separated from all my heart adores on earth. I'm firmly resolved never to leave you nor my dear boy again, not even for a week.
In 1800, the national capital moves from sophisticated Philadelphia to the undeveloped city of Washington, population 3,000. John and Margaretta set out for Kentucky at the end of the congressional session. Traveling by horse, wagon, and flatboat, the trip takes over 4 weeks. It is great adventure, taking his new wife and child to his home on Kentucky's frontier. The Frankfort that greets Margaretta in 1801 is a raw frontier village of about 650 people, It consists of a few log cabins and taverns, an inn, a new governor's mansion, and lots of mud. Margaretta must have been impressed then by the elegance of Liberty Hall and admiring of her new husband who had conceived and built it. As a young man, John Brown had worked in Thomas Jefferson's law office in Virginia, and Jefferson may have given Brown some advice on architecture. But mainly, John Brown designed it himself, no doubt inspired by books and buildings he had seen in his many travels. The Palladian window is considered one of the most beautifully proportioned and detailed in Kentucky. The layout is traditional with a central hall and 2 rooms on either side. The kitchen is in a wing in the back to prevent the spread of kitchen fires to the main house. Several enslaved persons helped with the voluminous housework. In the fall of that year, their second child, Orlando, is born. Medicine on the frontier was spare. Possibly Margaretta had a midwife, whom they paid somehow. Paper money was scarce, and barter was popular. Soon after, John goes back to Washington to serve in Congress. He most likely found his position at the hub of the new nation exhilarating. But the separations from Margaretta are painful. Their only communication is, once again, by mail. In John's absence, Margaretta takes charge of Liberty Hall and adapts to frontier life.
I do not feel as helpless as I thought I should. Judge Innes' Thomas has just called here with a present of a quarter of lamb. Nothing could have been more acceptable, for there are no fresh provisions to be had.
The Senate meets in this building, a wing of the Capitol under construction. Aaron Burr is president pro tem of the Senate, but Burr is ill, and Senator Brown is elected to preside in his place. John Brown's 22-year career as a legislator began when he first came to the Kentucky District through the Cumberland Gap. It was the early 1780s. At that time, Kentucky was still a part of the state of Virginia. His Virginia family was distinguished but not wealthy, and he must have been aflame with a young man's dream of a prosperous future on the frontier. Imagine the opportunity. Land was cheap. Legal, financial, and governmental infrastructure needed to be created. And if you were energetic and bright, as John Brown was, you jumped in with both feet. He settled in Danville, the hub of political activity at the time, and began to practice law. There was a land rush, and, following in the footsteps of his uncle, he was able to claim thousands of acres. He would spend the rest of his life struggling to defend those claims. Because he was well connected back in Virginia, his fellow Kentuckians sent the young Brown to represent their interests in the Virginia legislature. So John Brown, a political moderate, inexperienced, and perhaps constitutionally unsuited for the rough and tumble of politics, suddenly finds himself caught in the midst of raging controversies. One of Brown's missions was to assure that Kentucky become the next state, but there were problems. Settlers were plagued by Indian raids, and there was no easy way to get Kentucky's goods and crops to market because Spain blocked access to the Mississippi River. Spanish emissaries told Kentuckians they could use the Mississippi for shipping only if they would break away from the United States and become a part of Spain. There were powerful people who thought this Spanish conspiracy was the solution. This was a treacherous moment for Brown. It was a controversial decision when he chose to align himself with the forces who favored Kentucky joining the United States. Brown devoted 8 years to the cause of Kentucky statehood and must have derived personal satisfaction when Kentucky became the 15th state. Then he was elected as one of Kentucky's first 2 senators in Congress. Now it's 11 years later, and John Brown, at 45, has served his country well. He feels torn about leaving his home in Kentucky, where now reside his beloved wife and 2 babies. But his responsibility to his fellow Kentuckians and the thorny issues that demand attention pull him back to Washington. In 1803, Margaretta, back at Liberty Hall, bears their 3rd son, Alfred. In January 1804, John Brown receives this letter from his brother.
It is my task to apprise you of the death of your little boy, Alfred. I wish you could return to your family immediately. You have served the public for 20 years. It is enough to teach you the vanity of ambition and the emptiness of human greatness. All your friends are attentive and sympathizing.
These words must have caused great anguish. John Brown had always been hard-working and conscientious. But now, with 2 children and in the face of tragedy, the hearth tug is greater, and that hearth is 4 weeks away. John Brown writes to Margaretta's brother,
I still feel the wound in every fiber of my heart, but my fortitude forsakes me when I reflect upon the severe distress which my dear Margaretta must have experienced on so trying an occasion. Few of her sex can lay claim to equal strength of mind, but on the other hand, her sensibility and maternal tenderness are extreme.
In June of that year, their 4th son is born. They name this one, too, Alfred. He dies 2 months later. These tragedies weigh heavily on the couple. Margaretta finds strength in her religion. There are no churches yet in Frankfort. Hungry for spiritual sustenance, Margaretta welcomes every visiting preacher into Liberty Hall, which becomes the acknowledged center of religious influence in the village. John Brown runs again for the Senate in 1804, but the political climate has changed, and he loses. At last, he settles down with Margaretta at Liberty Hall. Over the years, John Brown devotes his energy to developing the new town of Frankfort. He helps build a bridge, buys the ferry, raises funds for the Capitol building. In 1807, they are blessed with a daughter, Euphemia, who quickly becomes the darling of the family. There are no schools in Frankfort yet. The well-educated Margaretta, along with a tutor, devotes herself to teaching her children. In 1810, Margaretta and her good friend and neighbor, Elizabeth Love, found the first Sunday school west of the Alleghenies.
This is the day the Lord hath made. He calls the hours his own.
Then in 1814, tragedy strikes again. Margaretta's brother writes back to New York about Margaretta.
The loss of Euphemia was a blow that felled her. She has pined till she has grown thinner than before her marriage. Grief has impaired her strength and furrowed her face, so that she has the appearance of young old age. Mr. Brown himself, even to this hour, is almost unmanned by it.
Margaretta's beloved aunt comes to visit from New York. But shortly after her arrival, she dies, bringing more grief to Liberty Hall. There is a family story that the aunt's ghost still haunts this room where she passed away. Dressed in her gray traveling clothes, she is known as the Gray Lady of Liberty Hall. Perhaps she comes to complete her mission, to console John and Margaretta. Liberty Hall's hospitality becomes legendary, is host to every passing dignitary. President Monroe comes to Frankfort. Margaretta to Orlando.
Your father presided at the public dinner and has been much distinguished by the president. Yesterday morning he breakfasted with us in company with General Andrew Jackson and that hero, Major Zachary Taylor.
Even the Revolutionary War hero, Lafayette, on a triumphal tour of the United States from France, stopped in.
There was a splendid ball to be given that evening. 12 or 14 of my particular friends took tea with me and urged me to go. I told them that I had not frequented any place of public amusement for many years, but they had not been gone more than 20 minutes when who should arrive here but General Lafayette.
She's afraid we're going to do something. That's it. It's not having much talk.
The general spent nearly an hour with us in most delightful conversation. Had I not a triumph?
Mason and Orlando both grow up to be lawyers. Since Mason, the oldest son, will inherit Liberty Hall, John and Margaretta build a house next door for Orlando in the Greek Revival style popular in the 1830s. What is unusual about Liberty Hall and the Orlando Brown house is that the direct descendants of John and Margaretta lived continuously in these two beautiful homes until the mid-20th century, when they were open to the public. In 1806, John Beckley, a fellow politician, had written to John Brown, "Emphatically, you are one of the founders of Kentucky, and there is erected to you an imperishable monument of honorable patriotism of which you can never be deprived." John dies in 1837. The next year, Margaretta dies and lies next to him in the Frankfort Cemetery. This state and this town were created by settlers like John and Margaretta, who went to the rugged and unknown territory of Kentucky and transformed it at a time when it took enormous courage and vision to do so.